Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The book I almost threw away. What if the book that changed my marriage was not a marriage book at all? One night in my home in the United States, I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of cold coffee. After a fight with my husband that had left me thinking, maybe I am done. My children were asleep upstairs. The house was quiet. And then I opened a self-help book I had almost thrown away. I expected boring advice. Instead, one sentence made me close the book and cry. I am going to tell you what that sentence was, why it shocked me, and how it slowly changed the way I spoke, listened, loved, and even practiced English. At that time, my life looked fine from the outside. I had a home, a husband, children, routines, grocery lists, school mornings, work, dinner, laundry, and the wonderfully American experience of wondering why everything costs more when you are already tired. But inside, I was exhausted. I was not only tired of my responsibilities. I was tired of repeating the same arguments. My husband and I loved each other. But love had started to sound like two people defending themselves instead of two people trying to understand each other. A simple question could become a disagreement. A quiet evening could become a cold silence. And sometimes I would lie awake thinking, how can two people who love each other feel so far apart? That was when I found the book. I did not read it quickly. I read it slowly, one page at a time. And strangely, that slow reading became part of my healing. I began reading short passages aloud in English. I listened to the rhythm of each sentence. I repeated simple phrases. I was not trying to become fluent overnight. I was simply training myself to slow down. That small habit taught me something surprising. When I slowed down my English, I also began slowing down my reactions. Instead of answering immediately, I started taking one breath. Instead of saying, "You never understand me," I tried, "I want you to understand how I feel." It sounds small. It was not small. It changed the conversation. And then, 3 nights later, my husband said something I had never expected to hear from him. I froze when I heard it, because those few words were connected to the exact page of the book that had made me cry. And that was the moment I realized this story was not really about a book at all. It was about what happens when you finally stop fighting to be right, and start fighting for the relationship you still love. The woman behind the smile. The strange thing about being unhappy is that you can become very good at looking happy. I learned that skill without realizing it. Every morning in my home in the United States, I could smile, make breakfast, answer my children's questions, check my phone, prepare for work, and say, "I'm fine," with such confidence that even I almost believed it. But behind that smile, I felt like I was carrying a suitcase full of stones. Nobody could see it. My husband could not always see it. My children certainly did not need to see it. And I had become an expert at pretending it was not there. My days were full. That was part of the problem. In American life, everything seemed to move quickly. School schedules, work messages, appointments, bills, traffic, shopping, meals. and endless small decisions filled the space between morning and night. Even relaxing could feel like another task. I would sit on the sofa and think, I should be doing something. My brain apparently believed that sitting quietly was a suspicious activity. But the real pressure was inside my marriage. I wanted my husband to notice when I was overwhelmed. He wanted me to tell him directly. I thought, if he loves me, he should know. He thought, if she needs help, she should tell me. There we were, two people who loved each other, waiting for the other person to read a manual neither of us had received. That realization was almost funny, except it was hurting us. The self-help book began to make me question my habits. It did not tell me to blame my husband or blame myself. Instead, it asked me to notice what happened inside me before I spoke. So I started a tiny practice. Whenever I felt angry, I paused and named the feeling in simple English. I am hurt. I am tired. I am afraid. I need a moment. These were not impressive sentences. They were basic English sentences. But they were honest sentences. And honesty was exactly what I had been missing. I also began reading those sentences aloud every morning. Slowly. Clearly. I listened to my own voice instead of rushing through the words. My English practice became strangely connected to my emotional life. The slower I spoke, the more carefully I listened. The more carefully I listened, the less I assumed. And the less I assumed, the fewer unnecessary arguments I created. Then one Saturday afternoon, something happened that completely surprised me. My daughter walked into the kitchen, looked at me for a few seconds, and asked a question so simple that I had no prepared answer. "Mom, why do you seem different lately?" I smiled. But this time, I could not hide behind the smile. Because she had noticed what I was only beginning to understand, the woman everyone thought was strong was finally learning how to be honest. The fight that changed everything. I used to think the biggest problems in a marriage arrive with dramatic music, slammed doors, and someone shouting, "We need to talk." In my case, it started with something much smaller, a missing phone charger. It was an ordinary evening in our home in the United States. The children were finishing dinner, I was tired from work, and my husband was looking for his charger. He asked me where it was. I said I did not know. He sighed. I heard that sigh, and something inside me immediately became defensive. I said, "Why do you always assume I moved your things?" He looked confused. I only asked a question. But I was no longer answering the question. I was answering every old argument I had stored in my head. Suddenly, the conversation became about everything. The dishes. The money. The children. Work. Time. Who did more? Who listened less? Who apologized first? It was almost impressive how quickly a phone charger became a courtroom. My husband finally said, "I don't know how to talk to you anymore." That sentence stopped me. Not because it was cruel, but because it sounded tired. He was not attacking me. He was telling me that he felt lost too. I wanted to defend myself, but I remembered the book. I remembered the sentence I had read a few nights earlier. Before you try to change the conversation, notice the emotion you bring into it. So I took a breath. In my head, I practiced a simple English sentence I had been repeating during my reading practice. I want to understand you. I almost laughed because it sounded so simple. Could 3 words really change anything? I looked at my husband and said, I want to understand you, not fight with you. He became quiet. I became quiet too. For the first time that evening, neither of us was preparing the next argument. We were listening. I told him I had been feeling overwhelmed and invisible. He told me he had been feeling pushed away and afraid that nothing he did was good enough. Neither of us was completely right. Neither of us was completely wrong. We were 2 exhausted people trying to protect ourselves from the person we actually wanted comfort from. That night, we did not solve our marriage. There was no magical movie ending. We simply talked for another 20 minutes without shouting. Then something unexpected happened. My husband picked up the self-help book from the table and asked, "Is this really helping you?" I said yes. He looked at the cover, smiled slightly, and said, "Then maybe I should read it too." I thought that was the end of the surprise. I was wrong. The next morning, he came downstairs before me, placed the book beside my coffee, and opened it to a page I had never read. What he said next made my heart drop. Maybe I am the problem. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen expecting nothing more than coffee, toast, and the usual chaos of family life. Instead, my husband was sitting at the table with my self-help book open in front of him. He looked unusually serious. I asked, "Did you read it?" He nodded and pushed the book toward me. A small piece of paper was sticking out between the pages. I pulled it out and saw a sentence he had underlined. Then he looked at me and said, "I think I have been waiting for you to change, when I should have been changing too." I honestly did not know what to say. For weeks, I had been quietly blaming myself for every problem in our marriage. Then suddenly, my husband was taking responsibility for his side too. It was emotional, but it was also uncomfortable, because real change is rarely as beautiful as people make it sound online. There is no soft music in the background when you realize your habits are part of the problem. Sometimes there is just a kitchen full of dirty dishes. I started thinking about my own behavior. When I felt criticized, I became defensive. When I felt ignored, I became silent. When I wanted help, I sometimes expected my husband to guess what I needed. And when he failed to guess correctly, I treated it like evidence that he did not care. That was painful to admit. But it was also freeing. The book helped me understand a simple psychological idea. We often react to the meaning we give an event, not only to the event itself. A short sentence can feel like an insult when we are already tired or afraid. So I began practicing a new habit. Before answering, I asked myself, what else could this mean? If my husband said, "Are you going to finish that?" Instead of thinking, he is criticizing me, I tried to think, maybe he is simply asking. It sounds almost ridiculously simple. But simple does not mean easy. I also used this habit during my English practice. When I read a sentence slowly, I stopped trying to understand every word immediately. I listened to the whole sentence first. Then I repeated it. Then I asked, what is the main meaning? That became a surprising lesson for my life too. I did not need to react to every single word. I needed to understand the whole message. My conversations with my husband gradually became calmer. Not perfect. Just calmer. We still disagreed. We still annoyed each other. Marriage did not suddenly turn into a romantic movie where everyone whispers beautifully over candlelight. But something important had changed. I was no longer asking, who is wrong? I was asking, what are we really trying to protect? Then, one evening, while reading another chapter aloud, I reached a sentence that made me stop completely. It suggested that healing does not begin when life becomes easier. It begins when we stop running from the uncomfortable truth. I closed the book. Because I suddenly knew there was one truth about myself I had been avoiding for years. I started reading English slowly. The truth I had been avoiding was simple. I was always rushing. I rushed through breakfast, rushed through work, rushed through conversations, rushed through my feelings, and somehow expected my mind to remain calm. That was almost like putting a blender on high speed and then asking the smoothie to stay in neat little pieces. So I decided to experiment with something very small. Every morning, before my family woke up, I sat at the kitchen table with my self-help book and read one short passage in English. I did not try to finish a chapter. I did not look up every unfamiliar word. I did not worry about sounding perfect. I simply read slowly. One sentence. One breath. One idea. Then I repeated it out loud. At first, I felt ridiculous. I knew some English, but speaking slowly made me notice every sound. My tongue felt awkward. Some words refused to cooperate. I would read a sentence, stop, laugh at myself, and try again. But after several mornings, something interesting happened. I started hearing English differently. Instead of seeing a long sentence as one large wall, I began hearing small pieces. I need some time. I understand what you mean. Let me think about that. These simple phrases became useful beyond language practice. I started using them in real conversations. When I was upset with my husband, instead of answering immediately, I could say, I need some time. When I disagreed, I could say, I understand what you mean. And when I did not know how to respond, I could say, let me think about that. These were basic English sentences, but they gave me something much more important than vocabulary, a pause. Modern psychology often emphasizes the value of creating a small gap between an emotional trigger and a response. That gap can help us choose a better reaction instead of automatically repeating an old one. For me, slow English reading became that gap. I was training my ears, my mouth, and, strangely enough, my patience. I even started listening to slow English audio while washing dishes or driving. I would repeat short phrases quietly in the car, hoping the other drivers could not see me talking to myself at red lights. If they did, they probably thought I was having a very serious conversation with an invisible passenger. Maybe I was. Little by little, my confidence grew. I was not suddenly fluent. My marriage was not suddenly perfect. But I felt more present. I was listening instead of preparing my next sentence. I was speaking instead of storing resentment. And one morning, my husband noticed my new routine. He stood in the doorway and asked, "Why do you read that book out loud every day?" I smiled and told him the truth, because I think it is teaching me how to speak to you, too. He laughed softly. Then he said something that completely changed the meaning of my morning routine. "Then maybe I should practice with you." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Small words changed my marriage. I thought my husband was joking when he said he wanted to practice with me, but the next morning he actually sat across from me at the kitchen table. There we were, two adults, drinking coffee. Reading simple English sentences like two students who had somehow enrolled in the strangest class in America. We both laughed at first. Then we started. I read a sentence slowly. He repeated it. Sometimes he pronounced a word differently. Sometimes I did. Sometimes we both laughed so hard that we forgot what we were supposed to be practicing. But something beautiful happened underneath the laughter. We were doing something together without trying to fix each other. That was new for us. One of the first sentences we practiced was, "I understand how you feel." It looked simple on the page. But saying it honestly was much harder. In our marriage, we had often listened while preparing our defense. Now we were trying to listen without immediately proving ourselves right. We started using small phrases during real conversations. "Can we talk later?" "I need a moment." "I understand." "I'm sorry." "What do you need?" These phrases were not magic. They did not prevent disagreements. They simply gave us better tools when emotions became strong. There is a useful idea in communication psychology. Naming an emotion can sometimes reduce its intensity because you are turning a vague internal storm into something your mind can recognize. I began doing exactly that. Instead of saying, "Everything is terrible," I tried, "I feel overwhelmed." Instead of, "You never listen," I tried, "I feel unheard." The difference was surprisingly powerful. My husband could respond to a feeling. He could not respond to an accusation that sounded like a permanent judgment. Our English practice also became more playful. Sometimes we chose one useful phrase and tried to use it naturally during the day. If one of us said something too quickly, the other would smile and say, "Slow English, please." That became our little family joke. Even the children started using it when someone spoke too fast at the dinner table. Soon, our home had a new rhythm. We still had bills. We still had busy mornings. We still had disagreements about chores and schedules. Life in the United States did not suddenly become easier. But we had learned to slow down inside the difficulty. That was the real change. I also began noticing something else. My children were watching us. They were learning how adults disagree. They were learning whether saying sorry was weakness or strength. They were learning whether love meant winning arguments or repairing them. One evening, after my husband and I had calmly solved a disagreement, my younger child looked at us and said, "You two didn't fight." We looked at each other and smiled. Then my husband answered, "We still disagreed." My child asked, "Then why are you smiling?" I looked at my husband, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Because we both knew the answer. We were finally learning that a peaceful marriage is not a marriage without conflict. It is a marriage where conflict does not get the final word. My children started noticing. Children are surprisingly good detectives. They may forget where they left their shoes, but somehow they notice everything adults think they are hiding. I learned this one evening when my daughter walked into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner and simply asked, "Mom, are you and Dad happier now?" I nearly dropped the spoon in my hand. I looked at her and asked, "Why do you think that?" She shrugged and said, "Because you talk differently." That sentence stayed with me. My children had noticed the changes long before I realized how visible they were. In the past, when my husband and I disagreed, the atmosphere in our home could change quickly. We might not shout, but silence can be loud too. A child can feel tension even when adults think they are being quiet. I did not want my children growing up believing that love meant walking on eggshells. So I became more intentional about what they saw. When I made a mistake, I apologized. When I was angry, I tried to say, "I need a few minutes to calm down," instead of disappearing emotionally. When my husband apologized, I tried to accept it instead of keeping the mistake alive as evidence for the next argument. These were small changes, but they created a different atmosphere at home. Our English practice became part of that change too. Sometimes after dinner, I would read a short passage aloud. The children would listen, and occasionally they would correct my pronunciation with the confidence only children possess. One evening, my son heard me repeat the sentence, "I can try again," and asked what it meant. I told him, "It means you do not have to be perfect the first time." He thought about it and said, "That sounds like school." I laughed. "Yes," I said, "and marriage, and English, and pretty much life." That became one of my favorite lessons. We often think progress should look dramatic. But real progress is usually boring. It looks like reading one page, saying one honest sentence, taking one breath before answering, trying again after making a mistake. Psychology often describes habits as becoming stronger when they are repeated in stable, familiar situations. That made sense to me. My kitchen became my practice room. My coffee became my reminder. My family became my reason to continue. I was not trying to create a perfect home. I was trying to create a home where people felt safe enough to make mistakes and honest enough to repair them. Slowly, my husband joined me more often in reading. Sometimes we practiced pronunciation. Sometimes we simply read and talked about the ideas. The book had become more than a book. It had become a doorway into conversations we had avoided for years. Then, one Sunday morning, my daughter walked into my room holding the book. She looked serious and said, "Mom, I want to ask you something about love." I smiled, expecting a simple question. Instead, her next words made me realize that everything happening in our family was about to become much deeper. What America taught me about life. My daughter looked at me and asked, "Mom, can people love each other and still hurt each other?" For a second, I had no answer. It was the kind of question that makes you suddenly forget every clever sentence you have ever learned. I sat beside her and said, "Yes, sometimes they can. But love also means learning how to repair the hurt." That conversation made me think about life in America in a completely different way. I had spent so much time trying to manage everything that I had forgotten something important. A good life is not a life where nothing goes wrong. It is a life where you learn what to do when things go wrong. In our home, we were still dealing with ordinary pressures. Work could be demanding. Family schedules could become complicated. Money required attention. Children needed time, patience, and about 17 reminders to put their shoes away. Some days, everyone was tired before dinner even started. I began to understand that these pressures did not automatically damage a marriage. What mattered was how we carried them together. The self-help book had taught me to stop searching for one giant solution. Instead, I focused on small actions. I listened for 5 minutes without interrupting. I asked my husband one question before giving my opinion. I thanked my children for small things. I read a few pages in English every morning. I repeated useful sentences aloud. These habits looked almost too ordinary to matter. But ordinary actions repeated consistently can become powerful. That idea also changed how I thought about English learning. I had once believed I needed long study sessions to improve. Now I saw that 10 quiet minutes every day could be more realistic than waiting for the perfect 2-hour study session that never arrived. I would read slowly, listen carefully, and repeat one sentence until it felt comfortable. Sometimes I practiced while making coffee. Sometimes I listened while cleaning the kitchen. Sometimes I spoke to myself in English and immediately laughed because, honestly, talking to yourself is only strange if nobody else is doing it. My confidence grew because I stopped demanding perfection. I started treating mistakes as information. If I mispronounced a word, I repeated it. If I misunderstood a sentence, I listened again. If I said something wrong to my husband, I tried again. The same principle worked everywhere. Life in America was teaching me that independence did not mean doing everything alone. Strength did not mean never asking for help. And love did not mean avoiding difficult conversations. Real strength was being willing to learn. That evening, after my conversation with my daughter, I went downstairs and found my husband reading the same book. He looked up and asked, "What did she ask you?" I told him. He became quiet. Then he closed the book and said, "Maybe our children are teaching us more than we realize." He was right. But what happened the next morning showed me just how far this little book had taken us. The book did not save me. The next morning, I woke up with a strange realization. The book had not saved me. For a few seconds, that thought sounded disappointing. Then I smiled, because it was actually the most empowering thing I had learned. A book can give you an idea. It can give you language. It can show you another way to think. But it cannot make the phone call for you, apologize for you, listen for you, or choose your next action. I had spent months looking for something that would magically fix my stress, my marriage, and my confidence. I wanted a perfect answer. Instead, I got a few simple pages and a lot of small decisions. Every morning, I still read slowly. I listened to English audio. I repeated short sentences. I sometimes stopped because a word was difficult. I sometimes made mistakes. But I no longer treated mistakes as proof that I was failing. I treated them as part of practice. The same thing happened in my marriage. We still disagreed. Of course we did. My husband still left things in strange places. I still got impatient. Sometimes our conversations still became tense. We were human, not characters in a motivational video. But the difference was that we had learned how to come back. If one of us spoke too harshly, we could stop. If one of us felt unheard, we could say it. If the conversation became too emotional, we could take a break and return later. That ability to return became one of the strongest parts of our relationship. I also noticed a change in myself. I no longer felt that every difficult day meant my life was going in the wrong direction. Some days were simply difficult. That was all. I could have a bad morning and still have a good evening. I could make a mistake and still be a good mother. I could struggle with English and still keep learning. I could have a disagreement with my husband and still love him deeply. That was freedom. One afternoon, I was sitting in the car waiting for my children when my husband called. He did not need anything. He simply said, "I was thinking about you." That tiny sentence meant more to me than a grand romantic gesture. Because months earlier, we had been struggling to speak honestly. Now we were reaching for each other in ordinary moments. I looked at the old self-help book sitting beside me and realized something important. Books do not heal people by themselves. They create moments of awareness. They give us words for feelings we could not explain. They remind us that change is possible. But healing happens through action, repetition, patience, and connection. That was the lesson I carried with me. I closed the book and looked at my reflection in the car window. I was still the same woman. Same family. Same responsibilities. Same imperfect English. But I was no longer the same inside. And then my phone buzzed with a message from my husband. It contained only 6 words. I read them twice, and suddenly I understood that our story had entered a completely new chapter. Books can open the door. The message from my husband said, "I'm proud of the woman you became." I stared at those 6 words for a long time. Not because I thought I had become perfect, but because I finally understood that I had stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me. The self-help book had not magically healed my marriage. It had simply opened a door. I was the one who had to walk through it. Today, my life in the United States is still wonderfully ordinary. There are busy mornings, school schedules, work responsibilities, grocery shopping, family dinners, unexpected expenses, messy rooms. And those mysterious socks that seem to disappear from the laundry as if they have their own secret immigration program. My husband and I still disagree. We still have difficult days. But now we know how to return to each other. We know how to pause. We know how to say, "I need a moment," instead of saying something we will regret. We know how to listen before defending ourselves. And sometimes, when life feels too serious, we sit together and practice English. We read a short paragraph slowly. We repeat a sentence. We laugh at a pronunciation mistake. Then we continue. That simple routine has become more than English practice. It reminds me that fluency is built one sentence at a time, just as trust is built one conversation at a time. And a strong family is built one ordinary day at a time. My children have noticed the difference too. They have seen their parents disagree and repair. They have learned that saying sorry is not weakness. They have learned that asking for help is not failure. And perhaps most importantly, they have learned that love is not about never hurting each other. Love is about caring enough to repair what has been hurt. When I look back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had thrown that book away that night. Maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe I would have eventually changed anyway. But I am grateful I opened it. Not because every sentence was perfect, but because it gave me the courage to ask better questions. Can I slow down? Can I listen? Can I try again? Can I become a little kinder to myself? Can I speak more honestly? Those questions changed me more than any motivational promise ever could. And if you are listening to this while feeling tired, discouraged, or stuck with your English, your relationship, your family, or simply yourself, remember this: you do not need to transform your entire life tonight. Read one page. Listen to one sentence. Speak one honest sentence. Take one small step. Then take another tomorrow. A book can open the door, but you choose whether to walk through it. And sometimes, the life waiting on the other side is not a perfect life. It is simply a more peaceful one. That is enough. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you keep learning, keep speaking, keep loving, and most importantly, keep trying.